In December, the United States had already shown what tanker seizure looks like. The target was the skipper, a sanctioned oil tanker near Venezuela. Helicopters approached the ship. Armed personnel descended onto the deck, and a commercial tanker became the object of a military-backed seizure at sea. Then came a harder case. A Russian flag oil tanker was chased across the Atlantic, boarded near Iceland, and taken under American control. It was called the Marinera. Before that, it was known as the Bella One, and its seizure was not just another sanctions case. It showed that the shadow fleet is no longer only a financial problem. It is becoming a maritime power problem. For years, Russia and other sanctioned actors have used fleets of tankers to keep oil moving through a world of sanctions, price caps, insurance restrictions, and political pressure. These ships are often old. Their ownership can be hard to trace. Their insurance can be weak. Their flags can change. Their routes can look normal on paper, but ambiguous in practice. This is the basic logic of the shadow fleet. If the legal trade becomes harder, the trade does not simply disappear. It moves into darker waters with more opaque ships, more uncertain paperwork, and more risk. That is why the Marinera matters. The United States did not only add a tanker to a sanctions list. It pursued a vessel for more than 2 weeks, used Coast Guard and military power, and eventually took control of it in the North Atlantic. The ship was linked to Venezuelan oil exports, but the larger signal reached far beyond Venezuela, because by the time the vessel was seized, it was flying a Russian flag. That created the harder question: was this a Russian ship protected by Russian registration, or was it a tanker trying to use the Russian flag as a shield after the pursuit had already begun? That question is not technical. It is strategic. On the open ocean, states cannot simply board any ship they dislike. Maritime law gives warships limited reasons to stop and board vessels on the high seas. Piracy is one reason, slavery is another, unauthorized broadcasting is another. A ship without nationality can also be boarded, but a properly registered foreign vessel is different. It carries the protection of its flag state. That is why the Marinera case matters. If the ship was legally Russian, the seizure looked like a very serious move against a Russian-flagged vessel. If the ship was effectively stateless, or if its Russia registration could not take effect during an active pursuit, then the United States had a stronger legal argument. Either way, the result was clear. Sanctions enforcement had moved from paperwork into naval action, and that is the real story of the shadow fleet. Russia's shadow fleet is not just a loophole. It is a floating network built around uncertainty, uncertainty over ownership, uncertainty over insurance, uncertainty over cargo, uncertainty over flags, and sometimes uncertainty over whether a ship can be stopped at all. This is why Europe has struggled to deal with it. European governments can see many of these vessels. They can sanction them. They can track them. They can warn them. They can threaten to board them, but seeing a ship is not the same as stopping it. The United Kingdom is a good example. After Prime Minister Keir Starmer threatened to allow military boarding of Russian shadow fleet ships, nearly 100 sanctioned vessels still crossed British waters in the following month. The flow did not clearly stop. The United Kingdom had hundreds of Russian-linked vessels on its sanctions list. But the ships kept moving. This is the gap between pressure and enforcement. On paper, sanctions can look powerful. At sea, they become complicated. A tanker is not a bank account. It is a physical object moving through real water, with a crew on board, a flag on the stern, a cargo in its tanks, and legal papers that may or may not tell the full truth. Stopping it can require patrol aircraft, Coast Guard vessels, naval ships, intelligence, lawyers, diplomats, and political courage, and if the tanker is old, badly insured, or carrying oil, one mistake can create an environmental disaster. That is the second problem. The shadow fleet is not only politically risky. It is physically risky. Many of these vessels are aging tankers. Some operate with limited transparency. Some are linked to weak insurance coverage. Some pass through crowded waters near European coastlines. If one of them breaks down, spills oil, or causes a collision, the cost may fall on the country nearest to the accident, not on the hidden network behind the ship. This is why the Baltic Sea, the English Channel, the Mediterranean, and the North Atlantic all matter. They are not just routes. They are exposure points. Every passage gives Russia a way to move oil, but every passage also gives Europe a problem it cannot ignore. The third problem is escalation. A tanker does not need to be a warship to create a military problem. If a sanctioned vessel claims Russian protection, then boarding it becomes more than a police action. It can become a test of Russian response, Western resolve, and the limits of maritime law. That is why the Marinera case was so important. The reported presence of Russian military assets in the region made the situation even more sensitive. There was no direct clash. But the message was obvious. The shadow fleet sits in the space between commerce and confrontation. It uses civilian ships, but it serves strategic purposes. It carries oil, but it also carries leverage. It tests sanctions, but it also tests navies. For Moscow, the logic is clear. Every barrel that moves helps reduce the pressure of sanctions. Every successful voyage proves that Western restrictions can be worked around. Every ambiguous ship forces Western governments to make a difficult choice. Ignore it, and the system keeps leaking. Stop it, and risk legal, environmental, or military consequences. That is why the shadow fleet is a floating problem. It is not one ship. It is not one route. It is not one legal trick. It is a method. It turns maritime complexity into political protection. It turns old tankers into tools of state power, and it turns sanctions enforcement into a question of naval will. The seizure of the Marinera did not end the shadow fleet, but it showed where the conflict is going. The next stage will not be only about adding names to sanctions lists. It will be about whether Western governments are willing to turn sanctions into action at sea. And that is much harder, because once a navy boards a tanker, the question is no longer just who owns the cargo. The question becomes who controls the sea. The shadow fleet is not just moving oil. It is moving the boundary between commerce, sanctions, and naval power. If you found this analysis useful, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next report.